Mallard. If you've ever seen a duck, you've seen a mallard. This is the duck. The one every cartoon borrowed, every children's book traced, every park pond was built around. That unmistakable iridescent green head on the male, the classic quack from the female, the orange feet paddling just below the surface. All of it traces back here. Mallards are the most widespread duck on Earth, found across North America, Europe, Asia, and beyond, thriving in everything from remote wetlands to city fountains. And here's something most people don't realize. That famous quack? Only the female does it. Males make a quieter, raspier sound that nobody ever puts in cartoons. Mallards are dabblers, meaning they feed by tipping head down into shallow water, tails in the air, grazing on aquatic plants and invertebrates near the surface rather than diving deep. It's a simple strategy, and it works basically everywhere. They'll eat seeds, insects, small fish, and whatever else is available, which is exactly why they've colonized the entire planet. They're also the genetic origin of almost every domestic duck breed in existence. The farmyard duck, the pekin, the rouen. All of them were bred from wild mallards over thousands of years of human agriculture. But their success comes with a hidden cost. Mallards interbreed freely with closely related species wherever they overlap. And in urban areas, released domestic mallards are quietly diluting the genetics of wild populations. Some rarer species, like the mottled duck and the Hawaiian duck, are being genetically absorbed, one hybrid at a time. The mallard isn't going anywhere, but its very dominance is becoming a problem for the ducks that live in its shadow. Wood duck. Before you even learn a single fact about this bird, you need to picture the male in breeding plumage. Iridescent green and purple head, chestnut chest, cream-colored throat with branching white stripes, a swept-back crest that looks designed by someone who thought regular ducks were too boring. The wood duck is genuinely one of the most visually striking birds in North America, and it lives in swampy woodland rivers and forested lakes, where the light filtering through the trees makes the colors even more absurd. But the looks are almost secondary to the story. Wood ducks nest inside tree cavities, sometimes up to 15 meters off the ground, in old woodpecker holes or natural hollows in large trees. The mother lays her eggs, incubates them, and then, within the first 24 hours after hatching, before the ducklings can fly, before they've learned anything about the world, she calls from the ground below, and the ducklings leap. One by one, they throw themselves out of the hole, tiny and weightless, bouncing off the forest floor and waddling after their mother toward the nearest water. They're not injured. Their light bodies and the cushioning of leaf litter absorb the impact, and they hit the ground running. It's one of the most dramatic opening acts in the animal kingdom. A one-day-old bird making a leap of faith before it's had a single meal. Wood ducks were hunted nearly to extinction by 1900, their spectacular plumage making them a prize target. Conservation efforts and the introduction of artificial nest boxes brought them back from the edge, and today their recovery is considered one of the great success stories of North American wildlife management. The nest boxes helped enormously, though females will sometimes pile dozens of eggs into a single popular box, a behavior called dump nesting, which creates more eggs than any single mother can successfully incubate. They're complicated birds in the best possible way. Mandarin duck. There is genuinely no preparing someone for a male mandarin duck. The description sounds made up. A duck with an orange sail-like feather rising from each wing like a decorative fin, a purple chest, a green and copper swept crest, white eye stripes, a red bill, and orange side whiskers. It looks less like a bird that evolved, and more like a ceremonial object someone carved and then accidentally released into a lake. The mandarin is native to East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and parts of Russia, where it nests in tree cavities along forested rivers and lakes. Another tree-nesting duck that begins its life with a leap to the ground. Males have those extraordinary sail feathers, called tertials, which fan upward during display, but serve no flight function whatsoever. They exist purely for spectacle, and they work. Mandarin ducks have been symbols of love and marital fidelity in Chinese and Japanese culture for centuries, appearing in wedding art and poetry as emblems of devoted pairing. And here's the irony: males actually abandon females shortly after incubation begins each year, leaving the female to raise the ducklings entirely alone. The cultural reputation and the biological reality are not exactly aligned. Today, feral mandarin populations established from escaped captive birds are thriving across Britain and parts of Europe, doing remarkably well in English parkland and woodland rivers, while native populations in China and Japan continue to decline due to deforestation and wetland loss. The most famous mandarin duck in recent memory appeared on a lake in Central Park in 2018, drawing thousands of visitors who had never knowingly watched a duck before. It disappeared after a few months as mysteriously as it arrived, but not before reminding an entire city that real birds can be stranger and more beautiful than anything invented. Northern pintail. Everything about the mallard is solid and dependable. Everything about the pintail is long and elegant, and built like it was designed by someone who thought ducks could afford to be a little more refined. Males have a chocolate brown head on a bright white neck, a gray body, and a tail that extends into two long central feathers. Needle sharp, trailing behind them in flight like a calligrapher's final stroke. In the air, pintails are among the fastest ducks on the planet, and their slim profile makes them unmistakable even at distances where color is impossible to read. They breed across an enormous range, Arctic tundra from Alaska to Siberia, and they migrate early, often heading south before any other duck species, riding the first cold fronts of autumn with an urgency that feels almost impatient. But beneath the elegance is a population story that should be getting more attention. Pintail numbers have declined dramatically since the 1970s, dropping from historical highs of around 10 million birds in North America to roughly 3 million today. The primary driver is drought on the prairie pothole breeding grounds, the shallow seasonal wetlands of the Great Plains that once held billions of gallons of water and now regularly dry up under increasingly erratic rainfall patterns. When the potholes dry, pinetails don't breed successfully. And unlike some duck species that can switch habitats, pintails are tied to open, shallow wetlands with sparse vegetation, making them one of the most drought-sensitive ducks in North America. The pinetail is proof that beauty doesn't equal security in the natural world, and that a species can be declining quietly for decades before anyone outside the waterfowl community pays attention. Northern shoveler. The shoveler is a duck that invites a double take. The body is normal enough. Male has a green head, chestnut flanks, white chest, reasonable duck proportions, and then your eye reaches the bill and something stops working. It's enormous, spatula-shaped, flattened, almost comically wide at the tip, like the duck borrowed a bill from a much larger and stranger animal and never gave it back. But that bill is actually a masterpiece of biological engineering. The edges are lined with fine comb-like projections called lamellae, and the shoveler uses them to filter tiny invertebrates, seeds, and algae directly from the water's surface, pumping water through its bill like a living sieve. It's one of the most specialized feeding strategies of any dabbling duck, and it means shovelers can harvest food sources that other surface-feeding ducks can't access efficiently. And here's the part that makes you stop. Shovelers often feed in groups, swimming in tight spinning circles, sometimes a dozen birds rotating together like a slow-feathered whirlpool, stirring up invertebrates from the bottom sediment, and then filtering them as the disturbed water passes through their bills. It's cooperative feeding that looks almost choreographed. Northern shovelers are found on every continent except Antarctica, breeding across North America and Eurasia, and wintering across an enormous global range, which makes them one of the most widespread ducks alive. Their main threats are the same as most dabbling ducks: wetland drainage across breeding grounds, agricultural conversion of shallow seasonal wetlands. But their adaptability and global range give them a resilience that more specialized species lack. The shoveler is what happens when evolution decides a duck's most important feature isn't its plumage or its speed, but the tool it eats with. Gadwall. Most people walk past a gadwall without a second glance, and that's exactly the problem. On first look, the male appears brown and unremarkable, just another duck at the edge of the pond, while the mallards and pintails steal the attention. But here's the thing. Get your binoculars on a male gadwall in good light, and something shifts. The entire body is covered in intricate gray vermiculations. Tiny, repeating wave patterns etched into every feather, that up close look less like a bird and more like expensive woven fabric, the kind you'd find in a tailor shop rather than a wetland. There's a crisp black patch at the rear, a white wing panel that flashes in flight, and an overall precision to the patterning that rewards anyone willing to actually look. Gadwalls are found across North America and Eurasia, breeding on shallow wetlands and wintering on lakes and reservoirs, often mixed in with flashier species that draw the eye first. They're common, adaptable, and quietly successful. The lesson the gadwall teaches is a simple one. The most overlooked thing in front of you is sometimes the most worth examining. Eurasian wigeon. You often hear the Eurasian wigeon before you see it. The male produces a clear, whistling call, a rising two-note sound that carries across open water and flooded fields like something between a wolf whistle and a flute. And once you've learned it, winter wetlands in Europe and Asia will never be quite silent again. Males are handsome birds, chestnut-headed with a creamy yellow forehead blaze and a pink flushed chest. But what makes wigeons genuinely interesting is their lifestyle. Unlike most ducks that feed on or below the water surface, wigeons are grazers. They wade onto mudflats and flooded grasslands and crop vegetation with their compact bills, behaving more like small geese than typical ducks. Large wintering flocks gather on estuaries and coastal marshes across Britain and northwest Europe, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, moving across the grass in a slow tide of chestnut and gray. They also steal food, wading near coots and diving ducks, then darting in to grab aquatic plants the other birds have hauled to the surface. This combination of grazing and piracy makes them surprisingly resourceful. Their dependence on eelgrass and other coastal vegetation creates a vulnerability, as eelgrass beds have suffered repeated disease and disturbance events, but wigeon numbers remain strong across most of their range for now. A duck that acts like a goose, sounds like a whistle, and feeds like a thief turns out to be one of the most watchable birds on any winter estuary. American wigeon. The American wigeon runs essentially the same playbook as its Eurasian cousin, with a few cosmetic differences, and the same unapologetic habit of letting other birds do the hard work. Males have a white forehead patch that gives them a slightly startled expression, a green eye stripe sweeping back from the face, and the same compact grazier's build. Like Eurasian wigeons, they feed on land, cropping grass and aquatic vegetation, and they're perfectly comfortable stealing food from diving ducks, wading at the surface while canvasbacks and Scaup haul up vegetation from the bottom, then rushing in to snatch the prize before the diver can eat it. It's a strategy so effective that wigeons are often found in mixed flocks, specifically positioned near diving species, essentially outsourcing the difficult part of feeding to other birds. American wigeons breed across western Canada and Alaska and winter along both coasts and into Central America. Prairie wetland conversion has pressured breeding populations, but they remain numerous and widespread. Their slightly masked facial pattern and the flash of white in flight make them easy to identify once you know what to look for, and their grazing flocks on coastal meadows in winter are one of the more peaceful and underappreciated sights in North American birdwatching. Regional wigeons, chiloe, and falcated duck. Two ducks on opposite sides of the world that each took the wigeon and dabbler blueprint and pushed it somewhere more elaborate. The chiloe wigeon, found across southern South America from Chile to Argentina, is a cold-weather grazer built for Patagonian wetlands and coastal grasslands, compact and purposeful, feeding in flocks on vegetation with the same methodical quality as its northern relatives. The falcated duck is something else entirely. An East Asian species whose males carry elongated curved tertial feathers that droop over the wings like a draped cape, creating a silhouette more elaborate than any wigeon and a presence on an Asian lake that stops you mid-stride. Both species face mounting wetland loss in their respective ranges, pressure that's easy to overlook because neither sits at the top of any conservation priority list. But they represent the reach and variety of a single evolutionary idea, the dabbling, grazing, opportunistic duck, expressed differently across hemispheres. Green-winged teal. The green-winged teal is the smallest dabbling duck in North America, barely larger than a pigeon, and it uses that size to do something no bigger duck can manage. It flies like a shorebird. Flocks twist and bank in unison with a coordination that looks almost computational. One bird shifts direction, and the entire group ripples through the same turn a fraction of a second later, folding and opening like a living shutter against the sky. Watching a flock of green-winged teal work a winter marsh is one of the genuinely dazzling experiences in birdwatching, and it happens fast enough that if you blink at the wrong moment, you miss the best part. Males have a rich chestnut head with a sweeping iridescent green eye stripe that shifts from bronze to jade depending on the light. And both sexes show the brilliant green wing patch, the speculum, that gives the species its name. They breed across boreal forests and tundra from Alaska through Canada, nesting in dense vegetation near water, and migrate early and in large numbers to wintering grounds across the southern United States, Mexico, and beyond. Green-winged teal are among the most heavily hunted ducks in North America, which makes careful management of their populations an ongoing priority. But they remain numerous, adaptable, and reliably spectacular in the air. Proof that in the duck world, being small doesn't mean being anything less than extraordinary. Blue-winged teal. There's something almost audacious about the blue-winged teal's migration. This is a small duck, weighing roughly the same as a large apple, with wings you could cover with both hands. And twice a year it flies from breeding grounds in Canada to wintering areas as far south as Peru and Argentina, covering thousands of miles over open water and unfamiliar terrain. The pale blue forewing patch that gives the species its name flashes in flight like a signal, and males carry a crisp white crescent on the face that makes them easy to pick out, even in mixed flocks moving fast overhead. Blue-winged teal are among the first ducks to leave in autumn, departing the northern prairies weeks before most other species feel the pull south, and among the last to return in spring, spending as little time as possible in the cold and as much as possible in the warmth. They breed in the prairie pothole region of North America, nesting in upland grasses near seasonal wetlands, and that dependence on shallow prairie potholes makes them one of the most drought-sensitive ducks on the continent. When dry years hit the Great Plains and the potholes shrink or disappear entirely, blue-winged teal breeding success collapses almost immediately. A small duck making a continent-spanning journey twice a year, entirely at the mercy of rainfall on one stretch of grassland. That's a precarious arrangement, and it's one worth paying attention to. Cinnamon teal. The cinnamon teal is basically the Western America's answer to the question of what happens when you take the blue-winged teal blueprint and turn the color dial all the way up. Males are a deep, saturated rust red, not orange, not brown, but a true cinnamon that in good light looks almost metallic, like hammered copper set afloat on a marsh. It's one of the most vividly colored dabbling ducks in the Americas, and it occupies a range that splits neatly into two separate populations, one breeding across the western United States and western Canada, the other resident across much of South America, with surprisingly little contact between them. Females, as with most teal, are streaky brown and easy to overlook, but males in breeding plumage are impossible to miss in the shallow wetlands and dense marsh edges they prefer. Their limited and somewhat fragmented range makes them more vulnerable than their abundance in good habitat might suggest. Localized wetland loss hits restricted range species harder than it hits birds spread across a continent. Garganey. The garganey is Europe's great vanishing act. It arrives in spring from sub-Saharan Africa, breeds quietly in wet meadows and marsh edges across Eurasia, and then disappears again before winter arrives. The only truly migratory breeding duck in Europe, a seasonal visitor that most people in its breeding range never actually register as present. Males have a bold white supercilium, a broad stripe sweeping back from above the eye, that makes them identifiable even at a distance, contrasting with a rich brown head and intricately patterned flanks. They're not common breeders anywhere, tending to appear in small numbers at scattered wetlands, rather than concentrating in obvious flocks, which adds to their reputation as a bird you find by chance, rather than by plan. They winter across a vast belt of Africa and South Asia, and drought conditions in the Sahel region, the semi-arid zone just south of the Sahara where many garganey congregate, have affected wintering populations in ways that are still being understood. The garganey is the kind of bird that rewards the people paying attention and remains invisible to everyone else. Present for one season in the reeds, then gone without announcement. African teals, Hottentot, red-billed, cape, gray, chestnut. Across the wetlands of sub-Saharan Africa and down through the lakes and rivers of Australia and New Zealand, a collection of small, fast, largely understated teals quietly holds together the dabbling duck story on two continents. The Hottentot teal is one of the smallest ducks in Africa, barely larger than a starling, working shallow tropical marshes with an efficiency that belies its size. The red-billed teal is named for exactly what you'd expect, and is one of the most common and widespread ducks in eastern and southern Africa. The Cape teal favors saline and brackish waters where other ducks rarely venture. The gray teal and chestnut teal carry the Australian and New Zealand end of this group. The gray teal being one of the most adaptable and nomadic water birds on the continent, moving across the interior in response to rainfall with a freedom most birds can't manage. None of these species are glamorous. All of them are essential. They represent the global reach of one of evolution's most successful small water bird designs, quietly distributed across two continents most duck documentaries never visit. Indo-Pacific dabblers, Sunda teal, Philippine duck, Pacific black duck. Thread a line from the Indonesian archipelago out through the Philippines, across New Guinea, and down into Australia and New Zealand, and you find a loose community of dabbling ducks that filled the ecological space mallards occupy in the northern hemisphere. The Sunda teal is a compact, dark-capped bird of island wetlands from Sumatra to the Lesser Sundas, adaptable enough to use everything from volcanic crater lakes to coastal mangroves. The Pacific black duck is Australasia's default duck, large, brown-streaked, found on virtually every body of fresh water from tropical Queensland to subantarctic islands. The bird Australians simply call the grey duck in New Zealand, and encounter so often it becomes almost invisible through familiarity. And then there's the Philippine duck, an endemic species found only in the Philippine archipelago, large and distinctive with a cinnamon-colored head and a contrasting gray body, and declining, facing hunting pressure and the steady loss of lowland wetlands and rice paddies that once gave it room to move. 3 ducks spanning an ocean, each doing the same job in a different island context, only one of them in real trouble. Spot-billed ducks, Indian and Eastern. Across the Indian subcontinent and into East and Southeast Asia, 2 large, handsome dabbling ducks fill the ecological role the mallard plays everywhere else. Common, widespread, adaptable, and easy to overlook precisely because they're so consistently present. Both species take their name from the yellow tip on an otherwise dark bill, a small detail that becomes a reliable field mark once you know to look for it. The Indian spot-billed duck is a bird of rivers, lakes, and rice paddies from Pakistan through India and into Myanmar. Large-bodied and boldly patterned with white tertial feathers that flash in flight. The eastern spot-billed duck carries the same basic design through China, Japan, Korea, and down into Southeast Asia. Where their ranges overlap with mallards, hybridization occurs, quietly blurring the genetic boundaries between species in the same way it does for the mottled duck and American black duck further west. They're not endangered, they're not rare, but they're the anchor of dabbling duck diversity across the most populous region on Earth, persisting in agricultural landscapes and urban wetlands where less adaptable species long ago disappeared. Mottled duck. The mottled duck has an identity problem, and it's not the duck's fault. It lives along the Gulf Coast of the United States and in Florida, in the narrow overlap zone where mallards, American black ducks, and escaped domestic waterfowl all converge, and it looks just similar enough to all of them that casual observers rarely register it as something distinct. But it is distinct, a true resident species, non-migratory, tied to the coastal marshes and freshwater wetlands of the Gulf Coast in a way that neither the mallard nor the black duck is. Males and females look similar, both a warm buffy brown with darker streaking, lacking the mallard's green head, but carrying a cleaner, less mottled appearance than the female mallard it superficially resembles. And here's the core threat: released and feral domestic mallards, descended from birds that escaped or were dumped from captivity, are breeding with mottled ducks wherever they meet, producing hybrids that are themselves fertile, which then breed back into the mottled duck population. It's a slow genetic erosion, not dramatic enough to make headlines, not fast enough to trigger emergency response, but persistent enough that some biologists consider hybridization the primary existential threat to the species. A duck that simply needs other ducks to stop moving into its neighborhood. American black duck. The American black duck is what a mallard looks like when it decides to take the wilderness seriously. Both species are closely related, both large dabbling ducks, but where mallards have colonized every city park and suburban pond on the continent, black ducks have consistently favored wilder, more remote, less disturbed wetlands. The tidal marshes of the Atlantic coast, the boreal bogs of Quebec and Ontario, the undisturbed river systems of the Northeast where human foot traffic is low and the reeds grow thick. Males and females look similar, both a deep sooty brown that in poor light reads as almost black, with a purple-blue wing patch and a contrast between the dark body and the pale face that gives them a distinctly more intense look than the mallard. They're among the wariest ducks in North America, consistently harder to approach, quicker to flush, less tolerant of disturbance, as though generations of hunting pressure selected specifically for caution. And that wariness hasn't been enough. Mallards expanding eastward into black duck territory are outcompeting them for nest sites and hybridizing with them at increasing rates, producing a slow-motion genetic replacement that has been running since at least the mid-20th century. Black duck numbers have fallen significantly from historical highs, and the species now functions as a kind of indicator. When black ducks are doing well in a region, the wetlands there are still genuinely wild. Mexican duck. The Mexican duck occupies a part of the continent most people don't associate with waterfowl at all: the high desert plateaus, mountain rivers, and interior wetlands of Mexico and the southwestern United States. A landscape of thin air, dry grassland, and surprisingly productive shallow lakes. It's a mallard relative, large and brown, recently recognized as a full species after years of being treated as a subspecies of the mallard, and it makes its living in exactly the kind of arid country wetlands that most dabbling ducks never reach. Males are slightly darker than females, both carrying a blue-purple speculum bordered in white, and the species forms small resident groups rather than the large migratory flocks that characterize most dabbling ducks at higher latitudes. Hybridization with mallards in zones of overlap is an ongoing concern, the same pattern that threads through so many of the mallards' nearest relatives. But the Mexican duck's stronghold in the interior highlands gives it some buffer. It's a duck shaped by dry country, by altitude, by the particular ecology of water, in a landscape where water is never guaranteed. Canvasback. Pull up a photograph of a male canvasback on winter water, and the first thing you notice is the head. A deep rust red that in certain light looks almost combustible, set against a black chest and a pale gray body so clean it almost reads as white at a distance. The second thing you notice is the profile. A long, sloping forehead that runs in an unbroken line from the top of the skull down to the tip of the bill, a shape so distinctive that experienced birders identify canvasbacks at half a mile without binoculars, just from the silhouette. This is North America's aristocrat of diving ducks, a bird with a quality of presence that other species simply don't have, and it spends its winters on large open bays and reservoirs where it dives to depths of up to 3 meters to harvest aquatic tubers. The roots and rhizomes of plants, like sago pondweed and wild celery, which it excavates from the bottom sediment with a bill built for exactly that purpose. Canvasbacks breed in the prairie pothole country of the northern Great Plains and into the boreal fringe, nesting in emergent marsh vegetation over water, and their population history is one of the most dramatic in North American waterfowl. Numbers crashed through the 1980s as drought shrank the prairie potholes, and agricultural drainage eliminated wetlands faster than birds could compensate, falling to lows that prompted serious alarm among wildlife managers. Recovery has been partial and fragile, contingent on rainfall patterns that are themselves becoming less predictable. When canvasback numbers drop, it's almost always a sign that the prairie wetland system is under stress. They're a flagship species in the truest sense, an indicator whose fate is tied to the health of an entire landscape. Redhead. The redhead has a secret it would rather you didn't know. Females of this species are among the most committed brood parasites in the duck world, meaning they regularly lay eggs in other birds' nests and leave without incubating them, without raising the ducklings, without any further investment whatsoever. Canvasback nests are a favorite target, which creates a strange dynamic on the prairie potholes where both species breed. Canvasbacks working hard to raise their own young while simultaneously, unknowingly, raising someone else's. Studies suggest that in some years, up to 40% of redhead females may parasitize at least one other nest, rather than, or in addition to, tending their own. It's a strategy that looks like laziness from the outside, but is actually a calculated hedge, spreading reproductive investment across multiple nests to improve the odds that at least some offspring survive. Males, for their part, are handsome birds, rounded chestnut head, gray body, pale blue bill with a black tip, and their rounded head profile distinguishes them cleanly from the slope-headed canvasback, even at distance. They dive for aquatic vegetation in lakes and marshes across western North America, breeding in the prairie pothole region and wintering on coastal bays and large inland reservoirs. Prairie wetland loss is the primary pressure, the same story that threads through most of the diving ducks breeding in the interior. But the redhead's flexible reproductive strategy, that willingness to outsource, gives it a resilience that more straightforward nesters lack. Common pochard. The common pochard is Europe's most quietly catastrophic duck story. Males are striking enough: rufous head, black chest, pale gray body, red eye, and they pack winter lakes and reservoirs across the continent in numbers large enough that birdwatchers can take them for granted, floating in dense rafts on urban reservoirs as reliably as the changing seasons. But the numbers have been falling for decades, roughly halving across the European wintering range since the 1980s, and the decline has none of the drama that would focus public attention on it. No single catastrophic event, no obvious smoking gun, just a slow and persistent reduction that accumulates across breeding sites from Iceland to Central Asia. Breeding habitat loss, changes in aquatic invertebrate communities affecting food availability, Disturbance at key sites. The pressures are multiple and interacting, which makes them harder to address than a single identifiable cause. The pochard is essentially Europe's canvasback, a handsome, once abundant diving duck in long-term decline, serving as an indicator of the health of lowland freshwater systems that have been drained, modified, and nutrient-loaded for a century. It still looks common. The trend line says otherwise. Tufted duck. The tufted duck is basically the punk of European diving ducks, and it owns it completely. Males are a clean, high-contrast black and white, jet black head, neck and back, bright white flanks, yellow eye, with a thin drooping crest at the back of the skull that looks permanently windswept, as though the bird spent the morning flying into a headwind and never bothered to sort itself out afterward. It's a look that's immediately distinctive and genuinely stylish in a low-key way. Tufted ducks are the most widespread diving duck across Europe and Asia, breeding from Iceland to Japan and wintering on lakes, reservoirs, and urban park ponds wherever open water holds enough invertebrates to sustain them. And here's an unexpected twist in their story. The accidental introduction of zebra mussels to European and North American freshwaters, an invasive species that most wildlife managers consider a disaster, has actually increased food availability for tufted ducks in some urban lakes, temporarily boosting local populations, even as broader habitat trends run against them. They're adaptable enough to exploit an invasive prey source while remaining dependent on water quality, clean enough to support invertebrate communities in the first place, which is a fine line to walk. A city reservoir, duck with a punk crest and an opportunist's instincts. Ring-necked duck. The ring-necked duck was named by a scientist working from a museum specimen, peering at a dead bird under lamplight, who noticed a faint chestnut collar on the neck and decided that was the feature worth commemorating. Every birdwatcher since has had to reckon with that decision, because in the field, on actual living birds, on actual water, at actual distances, that neck ring is essentially invisible. What you actually see is the bold white ring circling the bill near the tip, a feature so obvious and so diagnostic that the bird should by any reasonable logic be called the ring-billed duck. The naming complaint is basically a rite of passage in North American birdwatching, shared by beginners and experts with equal irritation. Beyond the nomenclature grievance, ring-necked ducks are compact, fast-flying diving ducks of boreal forest lakes and northern wetlands, with peaked heads that give them a distinctive angular profile, and they winter across the southern United States and into Central America in large numbers. Males are black-backed and black-chested with gray flanks and that telltale bill pattern. They dive for aquatic invertebrates and plant material in relatively shallow water, often in smaller lakes and ponds than Scaup and canvasbacks prefer. The boreal wetlands they depend on for breeding are under increasing pressure from drainage and development, but populations remain reasonably stable for now. A perfectly good duck, hampered only by its name. Scaup group, Greater, Lesser, New Zealand. The greater and lesser scaup are the identification nemesis of North American birdwatching, two species so similar in plumage, size, and behavior that dedicated birders spend entire winter afternoons working through mixed flocks on open water, looking for the subtle head-shape differences and nail-mark wing pattern details that separate them. Greater scaup have a rounder head with a green gloss. Lesser scaup have a peaked head with a purple gloss. In poor light, with birds at distance, moving on choppy water, those distinctions collapse entirely, and even experienced observers record them as Scaup species and move on. Both are diving ducks of open water, both in long-term decline across their North American ranges for reasons that aren't fully understood, both dependent on aquatic invertebrates in large lakes and coastal bays. On the opposite side of the world, the New Zealand Scaup sidesteps the identification problem entirely. A compact, dark, endemic diving duck found only on the lakes of New Zealand's main islands, small enough and geographically isolated enough to be unmistakable in its own context. 3 Scaup, 3 continents, 1 shared blueprint of diving and confusion. Rare diving ducks, Bear's pochard, Madagascar pochard, ferruginous duck. Some ducks don't get the luxury of a slow decline. Bear's pochard, a handsome diving duck of East Asian lakes and rivers with a dark glossy head and rich chestnut flanks, has essentially vanished from most of its range within living memory. A species that was never abundant, but was at least regularly encountered, now reduced to scattered records and genuine uncertainty about whether a viable wild population still exists at all. The Madagascar pochard went further. It was declared extinct, written off, removed from the list of living things. And then, in 2006, a small group was found on a remote highland lake in northern Madagascar. A rediscovery that felt like a miracle until researchers realized the population numbered in the tens was failing to raise ducklings successfully and occupied a single degraded lake with no obvious path to recovery. Conservation breeding programs are now the species' primary lifeline. The ferruginous duck, a rich chestnut diving duck of European and Central Asian wetlands, hasn't collapsed as dramatically as the other two, but has declined steadily across its western range, losing ground to wetland drainage and water quality deterioration, with the quiet persistence of a species whose problems are real, but not yet catastrophic enough to force urgent action. 3 diving ducks. 3 different points on the spectrum between vulnerable and gone. Common eider. Stand on a rocky Arctic shoreline in early summer, and the sound hits you before the sight does. A low, crooning call from the males, almost conversational, drifting across the colony like something between a moan and a question. Then you see them. Hundreds of large, heavy-bodied ducks moving through the surf. The males in their breeding plumage, a striking combination of black and white with a wash of green on the nape and a pale pinkish flush on the chest. The females a rich, warm brown with precise dark barring that disappears perfectly against a rocky nest. The common eider is the largest duck in the northern hemisphere, a bird built for cold water and raw coastlines, and it has been woven into the human story of the Arctic for over 1,000 years. The connection runs through eiderdown, the insulating feathers that females pluck from their own chests to line their nests, creating a lining so warm and so light that it remains, even now, among the finest natural insulators ever identified. In Iceland and Norway, coastal communities have harvested eiderdown sustainably for centuries, carefully collecting the down after the ducklings leave without disturbing the nests, maintaining a relationship with the birds that functions as much as stewardship as harvest. Females incubate their eggs without eating for nearly a month, living entirely off stored fat while sitting through Arctic weather that would defeat most animals. They nest colonially on islands and rocky shores, and groups of females often pool their ducklings into creches. Large mixed groups, supervised by a few adult females, while the others rest and recover from the demands of incubation. Climate change is warming Arctic breeding grounds faster than almost anywhere else on Earth, shifting the timing of sea ice breakup, altering the invertebrate communities the eiders depend on, and compressing the narrow seasonal window in which successful breeding is possible. A duck that built a human industry and an Arctic ecosystem simultaneously is now navigating a landscape that is changing faster than any previous generation of eiders has experienced. King eider. The king eider's most distinctive feature is so improbable that it looks like something added by a designer who wasn't sure they'd gone far enough. Males carry an enormous orange-red frontal shield, a swollen, brightly colored plate rising from the base of the bill and extending up onto the forehead, that in the right light makes the bird look less like a waterfowl and more like it's wearing a ceremonial mask. Combined with a pale blue-gray head, green cheek patches, black body, and white chest, it's one of the most extravagantly ornamented ducks alive. King eiders breed on the high Arctic tundra of North America, Greenland, and Russia, nesting in low vegetation near water, and they winter offshore in the North Atlantic and North Pacific in flocks that can number in the thousands. What they do in winter is remarkable even by sea duck standards. They dive to extraordinary depths to harvest mollusks, sea urchins, and other bottom-dwelling invertebrates, with recorded dives exceeding 50 meters, roughly the height of a 15-story building, powered entirely by wings and feet against water pressure that would disorient most birds entirely. Their remote breeding grounds make population monitoring genuinely difficult, and climate change is altering sea ice distribution in ways that affect both foraging habitat and the migration routes between breeding and wintering areas. The crowned diver of the Arctic, a duck that looks ceremonial and lives at depth, spectacled eider. For most of the 20th century, the spectacled eider's winter destination was simply unknown. Birds left their breeding grounds in Alaska and Siberia each autumn, and then nothing. No sightings, no records, no indication of where tens of thousands of birds spent the coldest months of the year. Then, in 1995, researchers attached satellite transmitters to spectacled eiders and followed the signals to a specific area of the Bering Sea, where open leads in the pack ice concentrated the birds in an area roughly the size of a small country. Nearly the entire world population of spectacled eiders was wintering together in near total isolation, diving for clams through gaps in the sea ice, invisible to human observers and completely unknown to science until technology made the tracking possible. Males are unmistakable. White eye patches surrounded by a ring of dark green feathers create the goggle-like spectacled pattern that names the species, giving the face a look of wide-eyed intensity. They breed on coastal tundra in Alaska and Siberia, and the Alaskan population has declined significantly since the 1970s, prompting threatened species listing and ongoing research into the causes. The mystery solved by satellite remains one of the great waterfowl discoveries of recent decades, a reminder that even in the modern era, entire populations of birds can exist in places no one thought to look. Steller's eider. Next to its larger relatives, the Steller's eider looks almost like it wandered into the wrong group. It's compact, closer to a large teal in size than the bulk of a common or king eider, and males have a warm rust-orange underside, white head with a green spot behind the eye, and a small curl of feathers at the rear that gives them an almost decorative quality. They breed on the coastal tundra of Siberia and Alaska, nesting in low vegetation and feeding in shallow coastal waters, and they winter along the coasts of Norway, Alaska, and the Aleutian Islands in flocks that gather on sheltered bays and inlets. The Alaskan breeding population has declined severely since the mid-20th century, and the species is listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, with causes that likely include changes in Arctic ecosystems, predation pressure, and contaminants accumulated through the food chain. It's the smallest and least known of the four eider species, the one that gets the fewest column inches in waterfowl guides and the least public recognition. The forgotten eider, carrying the most precarious status of the group. Harlequin duck. The harlequin duck made a choice that no other duck really made. It decided that the most violent, coldest, loudest water available was exactly where it wanted to be, and it built its entire existence around that decision. Males are painted in an improbable arrangement of slate blue, chestnut, and white, slashes and spots and stripes distributed across the body in a pattern that looks designed rather than evolved, like someone took a plain dark duck and added markings with a fine brush. They breed along fast mountain rivers in western North America, Iceland, and eastern Russia, nesting on the banks of streams where the water moves fast enough to overturn boulders, feeding by swimming directly into the current and plucking invertebrates from the riverbed while the water tries to push them downstream. Then, in winter, they move to rocky ocean coastlines and feed in the surge zone, the strip of churning white water where waves hit rock, using their compact bodies and powerful feet to hold position. In conditions where most birds couldn't stay upright, they dive and swim using both wings and feet together, moving through turbulent water with a control that looks almost casual from the shore. The Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 devastated harlequin populations along the Alaskan coast, and some local groups still haven't fully recovered decades later, a reminder of how catastrophically a single event can affect a species tied to a specific stretch of coastline. A duck that chose the hardest possible habitat and built itself perfectly for it. Long-tailed duck. Before it had its current name, the long-tailed duck was called the old squaw, a name retired in the early 2000s. But whatever you call it, the sound it makes is something you don't forget. Males produce a rolling, yodeling call that carries enormous distances across Arctic bays and tundra lakes in spring, a sound so loud and so musical and so persistently repeated that breeding areas hold a kind of constant low celebration during the nesting season. They're handsome birds with complex seasonal plumages, 4 distinct plumage states across the year, more than almost any other duck, shifting between dark and white configurations as the seasons change, with long pointed tail feathers on males that trail behind them in flight like a signature. And then there's what they do underwater. Long-tailed ducks are the deepest diving ducks on Earth, with recorded dives reaching 60 meters, roughly the height of a 20-story building, to reach mollusks and crustaceans on the seafloor. For context, most diving ducks work at depths of 3 to 10 meters. 60 meters is a completely different physiological commitment, requiring adaptations in oxygen storage and pressure tolerance that make the long-tailed duck genuinely unusual among waterfowl. They breed across the circumpolar Arctic and winter offshore in large flocks on northern seas, and their populations have been declining across much of their range for reasons that aren't fully understood. A species giving off warning signals in a habitat remote enough that the signals are hard to read clearly. Scoters, black, surf, white-winged. 3 large, dark sea ducks winter in enormous offshore rafts along both coasts of North America and Eurasia, and each one is identifiable mainly by the extravagant bill ornamentation that evolution saw fit to apply to otherwise very similar black birds. The black Scoter is the plainest of the 3, males almost entirely black, with a bright orange-yellow knob at the base of the bill that glows against the dark feathering like a small flame. The surf Scoter is more elaborate, a black body with white patches on the forehead and nape, and a large, swollen, multicolored bill in orange, white, red, and yellow that looks painted on by an artist who rejected subtlety entirely. The white-winged Scoter is the largest of the 3, adding white secondaries that flash in flight to an otherwise dark profile, its bill ornamented with a black knob and orange tip. All 3 are declining across their North American ranges, facing pressures from offshore pollution, changes in prey availability linked to shifting ocean conditions, and disturbance at key wintering sites. They're not glamorous conservation stories. Large dark ducks on distant gray water don't generate the public attention that brightly colored species do. But their long-term decline is a signal worth paying attention to. Common goldeneye. The common goldeneye is named for its iris, and once you've seen it, a burning, saturated yellow that gives the bird an almost supernatural intensity, especially in the low light of a winter morning. The name makes complete sense. Males have a dark, iridescent green head that shifts between black and jade depending on the angle of light, a white body, and that blazing eye, and they perform one of the more theatrical courtship displays in the duck world, throwing the head sharply backward until it nearly touches the back, then snapping it forward again with a jerking motion that looks like the bird is repeatedly startled by something behind it. Females watch and apparently evaluate because the display is performed competitively, multiple males displaying simultaneously near a single female. Goldeneyes are cavity nesters, breeding in holes in old trees along boreal forest lakes and rivers. Effectively sea ducks that begin their lives in a forest, dropping from a nest cavity to the water below shortly after hatching. Females show strong site fidelity, returning to the same lake and often the same nest tree year after year, which makes them dependent on the continued availability of mature trees with natural holes. They respond well to nest boxes, one of the conservation interventions that actually works cleanly, and box programs have extended their breeding range into areas where old-growth trees are no longer available. A sea duck that needs a forest to exist. Barrow's goldeneye. The Barrow's goldeneye is essentially the common goldeneye's more selective sibling. Same general design, same cavity nesting lifestyle, same blazing eye, but restricted to mountain lakes and cold rivers in western North America, and a geographically isolated population in Iceland, giving it a rugged, specialist quality that its more widespread relative lacks. Males have a purple glossed head rather than green, and a crescent-shaped white facial spot rather than the oval patch of the common goldeneye. Small differences that become significant when you're trying to separate the two species on a winter lake where both are present. The Icelandic population is genetically distinct and geographically isolated enough to behave as a separate unit, breeding on highland lakes and wintering on the island's coastal bays and rivers. Both populations are small enough that local disturbance, a degraded breeding lake, a poor nesting season, a contamination event, registers immediately in the numbers. The Barrow's goldeneye is a bird for people who look carefully at goldeneyes rather than past them, a reward built into a species most observers log and move on from without a second glance. Bufflehead. The bufflehead is North America's smallest diving duck, a bird so compact it could fit comfortably inside a football helmet, and yet the male carries an iridescent head patch, white and purple and green, shifting with the light, so disproportionately large relative to his body that he looks permanently slightly top-heavy, like someone bolted an oversized helmet onto a bird that didn't need one. They're fast in flight, direct and purposeful, and on winter lakes, they dive and resurface with a quick efficiency that makes watching them almost meditative. But here's the constraint that makes bufflehead ecology genuinely interesting. They nest exclusively in old nest holes excavated by northern flickers, a large woodpecker, and they are too small to use the standard duck nest boxes that work for wood ducks and goldeneyes. No flicker holes, no bufflehead breeding. This ties their reproductive success directly to the availability of mature forests where flickers are present and where old trees hold usable cavities. A dependency chain that makes forest management in boreal and montane regions directly relevant to bufflehead numbers. Introduced European starlings compete aggressively for the same cavities, evicting flickers and reducing available nest sites in areas where starling populations are high. Bufflehead are also among the more monogamous of ducks, with pairs often reuniting in successive years, a fidelity that's unusual in a group where seasonal pair bonds are the norm. A tiny duck with an oversized head patch and a very specific housing requirement. Smew. The smew is possibly the most graphically striking duck in the Northern Hemisphere, and it achieves that status through restraint rather than extravagance. Males are almost entirely white, clean, brilliant white, with fine black lines tracing across the head, back, and flanks in a pattern so precise and so geometric it barely looks biological. The black eye patch, the black back, the thin lines running down the sides. All of it together creates something that looks less like a bird and more like a woodblock print of a bird, a Japanese ink drawing given 3 dimensions, and set afloat on a European winter lake. Smew are the smallest mergansers, compact and fast, breeding in tree cavities along boreal forest rivers and lakes across Russia and Siberia, and wintering on freshwater lakes and reservoirs from Britain through Central Europe to Eastern Asia. Females are completely different in appearance, gray-bodied with a chestnut cap and white cheeks. Different enough that early naturalists classified them as separate species. On European wintering lakes, the appearance of a male smew among the usual diving duck assemblage creates a noticeable pause among birdwatchers, a moment of recognition followed by the particular satisfaction of finding something that rewards looking. Dependent on old boreal forest for nesting cavities and clean water for the fish and invertebrates they hunt, smew numbers wintering in Western Europe have declined in recent decades, likely reflecting both forest changes on breeding grounds and shifts in the wintering distribution eastward as milder winters reduce the freeze that once pushed birds further west. Hooded merganser. The hooded merganser's best trick takes about a third of a second. Males carry a large, fan-shaped crest, white at the center, black at the border, that can be raised or lowered almost instantaneously, transforming the bird from a sleek, low-profiled swimmer into something that looks dramatically larger and more ornate between one breath and the next. During courtship, males raise and lower this crest repeatedly, sometimes multiple times in a single display sequence, and the effect is startling every time, regardless of how many times you've seen it. A disappearing act in reverse, a bird that keeps revealing itself as more spectacular than it appeared a moment ago. Hooded mergansers are the smallest North American mergansers, nesting in tree cavities along forested streams, rivers, and woodland lakes, where the clear water allows them to hunt fish, crayfish, and aquatic invertebrates with the precision their serrated bills are built for. Males are unmistakably patterned, black head and back framing that extravagant crest, chestnut flanks, white chest with black vertical bars, while females are warm brown with a smaller shaggy cinnamon crest that has its own quiet appeal. They're dependent on both old trees with natural cavities and water clean enough to support the invertebrate and fish communities they feed on, making them sensitive to both deforestation and water quality degradation simultaneously. Females will lay eggs in each other's nests opportunistically, similar to wood ducks, sometimes resulting in a single nest holding far more eggs than one female can successfully incubate. A duck defined by transformation. The crest that changes everything. Common merganser. The common merganser is what happens when a duck decides to become a fish specialist and commits to it completely. The bill is long, narrow, and serrated along both edges, not like the filtering lamellae of dabbling ducks or the broad spatula of a shoveler, but with actual tooth-like projections designed specifically for gripping slippery, struggling fish in fast-moving water. Males are large and cleanly patterned, dark iridescent green head, white body with a salmon pink flush, red bill and feet, a combination that looks almost tropical on a cold northern river. Females have a rust brown head with a shaggy crest and gray body, and they're the ones making the nesting decisions. Cavity nesters, like the goldeneye and bufflehead, returning year after year to the same river stretches and the same nest trees, where their body memory says breeding works. Common mergansers hunt by swimming underwater with their eyes open, chasing trout and salmon and whatever else the river offers, their torpedo-shaped bodies moving through current with a fluency that genuinely resembles a seal more than a duck. Historically, they were persecuted heavily by fishermen and river managers who considered them competitors for salmon and trout, and culling programs in Britain and parts of North America ran for decades. The evidence that mergansers cause meaningful reductions in fish populations has never been convincing, but the persecution continued long past the point where the science supported it. Today, they're largely protected, and a common merganser working a clear river, diving, surfacing, shaking a fish into swallowing position, remains one of the most compelling things to watch in freshwater bird watching. Red-breasted merganser. The red-breasted merganser has hair, or what looks like hair, a wild, double-pointed crest of thin, elongated feathers projecting from the back of the male's head in multiple directions simultaneously, creating the impression of a bird that encountered a strong crosswind at a formative moment and never fully recovered. Combined with a dark green head, white collar, streaked rust-brown chest, and red serrated bill, the overall effect is of a bird that rejected the clean aesthetic choices its relatives made and went in a completely different direction. Red-breasted mergansers are more maritime than common mergansers, breeding along Arctic and subarctic coasts, rivers and lakes, and wintering on coastal bays and estuaries where they dive for fish in saltwater as readily as fresh. And here's the fact that stops people. The red-breasted merganser holds a credible claim to being the fastest duck ever recorded in level flight, with at least one documented case of a bird clocked at over 100 miles per hour with a tailwind assisting. Most sources are cautious about the exact figure, and conditions matter, but even conservative estimates put them among the fastest birds in level flight of any species. A disheveled-looking duck with a speed record buried in its biography, hunting fish in cold coastal waters that most ducks never visit. Brazilian merganser. The Brazilian merganser is one of those species that conservation biologists discuss in a particular tone: quiet, careful, aware that the numbers don't leave much room for optimism. Fewer than 250 individuals are believed to remain in the wild, scattered across fast-flowing, crystal-clear rivers in the highlands of Brazil, with tiny remnant populations in Argentina and Paraguay. It's a dark, slender merganser with a shaggy crest, white speculum, and the serrated bill its family is known for, dependent on rivers so clean and so fast and so well oxygenated that the fish communities it hunts can actually survive there. That dependency is precisely the problem. The rivers of the Brazilian highlands have been dammed for hydroelectric power, degraded by agricultural runoff, silted by deforestation on the surrounding slopes, and disturbed by human activity at a rate that has outpaced the merganser's ability to find alternatives. Clean, fast rivers in tropical South America are not increasing. The Brazilian merganser doesn't adapt to degraded water the way mallards adapt to city ponds. It requires specific conditions, and those conditions are shrinking. Conservation efforts exist, centered on protected areas in Minas Gerais and Goiás states, but the population is fragmented enough that individual local losses matter enormously. A merganser that needs a river system that still works, in a landscape where fewer and fewer do. Scaly-sided merganser. The scaly-sided merganser gets its name from the distinctive scale-like markings on its flanks. Pale feathers edged in dark, creating a reptilian texture unlike anything else in the merganser family, a pattern that makes the bird look armored, in a way that sits somewhere between beautiful and unsettling. It breeds in mature forest along fast, clear rivers in the Russian Far East and northeastern China, nesting in tree cavities over or near the water, and winters downstream in eastern China, Korea, and Japan on rivers and coastal estuaries. The breeding habitat requirement is specific: old-growth riverine forest with large trees for nesting and clean water with sufficient fish. Both are in decline across its range, which is why the species is classified as endangered, with a global population estimated in the low thousands. It's a bird that almost nobody outside dedicated birdwatching circles has heard of, which makes building conservation momentum difficult. It lacks the charisma of a panda or the cultural weight of a crane, but it faces threats just as serious. A scaly, quietly armored merganser holding on in remote river forests that the modern world is systematically simplifying. Ruddy duck. The ruddy duck's courtship display is one of the more ridiculous performances in the bird world, and it owns that completely. Males beat their bright sky blue bill against their chestnut chest rapidly, a rapid drumming motion that produces a hollow thumping sound and bubbles the water directly beneath them, creating a small foamy patch that appears to be part of the intended effect. The whole sequence ends with the male stretching forward and producing a belching call that removes any remaining dignity from the proceedings. It works, apparently. Ruddy ducks are compact, stiff-tailed North American diving ducks. The stiff tail held cocked upward is the family signature, with males in breeding plumage a rich chestnut with a white cheek patch and that improbable blue bill. They're native to the Americas, breeding across western North America, and wintering on coastal bays and large inland lakes. And here's where the story gets complicated. Ruddy ducks were introduced to Britain as captive waterfowl in the mid-20th century, escaped, established a feral breeding population, and then began appearing in Spain, where the globally endangered white-headed duck breeds in small numbers. The two species hybridize freely, and the hybrids are fertile, meaning the ruddy duck's genetics were being absorbed into one of Europe's rarest waterfowl. Eradication programs have been running in Britain for decades, culling feral ruddy ducks to protect a species on the other side of the continent from the consequences of a captive collection decision made generations ago. A duck causing an accidental conservation crisis thousands of miles from home. Stiff-tails of the southern hemisphere, blue-billed duck, macoa duck, white-headed duck, 3 continents, 3 stiff-tailed diving ducks, and 1 shared visual signature, the swollen, powder blue bill on breeding males that signals sexual fitness in the same extravagant language across Africa, Europe, and Australia. The white-headed duck of Europe and Central Asia is the most imperiled of the 3. Its small fragmented populations in Spain, Turkey, and Central Asia facing the double pressure of habitat loss and genetic contamination from hybridization with introduced ruddy ducks, a crisis that has consumed significant conservation resources and is still not fully resolved. The macoa duck occupies southern and eastern Africa, diving in alkaline lakes and permanent wetlands where its stiff tail and compact build let it navigate dense aquatic vegetation with ease. The blue-billed duck is Australia's representative, a quiet resident of deep permanent wetlands in the southeast. The male's blue bill vivid against dark rufous plumage in the breeding season. All 3 are proof of convergent evolution, the same environmental pressures producing the same solution in parallel across 3 continents, the blue bill arriving independently each time as the answer to the same question about what female stifftails find worth selecting: masked duck. The masked duck has made privacy its survival strategy. It lives in dense, emergent marsh vegetation across a range stretching from southern Texas through the Caribbean and Central America to Argentina, and it almost never comes out into the open. Where other ducks gather on open water, the masked duck threads through reed stems and aquatic grasses, feeding in cover so thick that even researchers who know it's present in a wetland may never get a clear view. Males have a black facial mask on a rich rufous body, white wing patches that flash briefly in the rare moments of flight, and the stiff-tailed family posture. But you have to earn the sighting because this bird will not cooperate. Its population status across much of its range is genuinely uncertain, not because it's necessarily rare, but because it's so difficult to detect and survey that the data simply doesn't exist to say with confidence how it's doing. It occasionally turns up in Florida and the Gulf Coast as a rare visitor, generating excitement among birdwatchers who understand what it takes to find one. A duck that treats concealment not as a last resort, but as a first principle. The bird that doesn't want to be found, and usually isn't. If you want to see more species explained, click video on screen now and subscribe.